Hi, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the MarquetteHoops.com basketball show with the great John Dodds, our historian, and our producer, Jason Ruck. I'm Tom Pippins, and we are very, very thankful, of course, to be brought to you again by Moonlight Graham, Modern Dental Benefits. Moonlight Graham, a proud sponsor of this program, and we appreciate Craig Caston. And we welcome to the show another sponsor, Sartori Cheese. Jim Sartori, another one who's just outstanding in the community, and we thank them for being with us. You have another great guest for this edition of the show, John.
Yes, Steve Ashburner from NBA.com, and he'll be on. He covered Marquette as a student for the Tribune, 1976 through 1978. Some of Marquette's greatest teams. He was there covering for the Tribune on the championship season. We'll talk to him about that.
Look forward to going down memory lane here. And as we do, we want to say that Steve is brought to you by Moonlight Graham, Modern Dental Benefits. Moonlight Graham, a proud sponsor of the MarquetteHoops.com basketball show, and Sartori Cheese. We welcome them. Jim Sartori, we appreciate your coming aboard and being part of the team. Here we go. The passion was always there from the beginning, obviously, for you, Stephen. You were there even as a student before you got involved. In the salad days of the program, it had to be just amazing to be covering the team, just to be around the team as a student.
Well, I mean, I don't think it's too much to say that if not for Marquette's basketball program, I'm not sure I would have ended up there in their journalism school. They actually were, they were in the Final Four the year I was a senior in high school in the Chicago suburbs. In fact, one intersection of these things was I was working on a story for my high school paper the night of the championship game. And I called our high school coach to get a short phone interview. And I was a little bit oblivious to the game time for that NCAA title game. And he picks up the phone, and when he finds out who it is and why I'm calling, he yells at me, "I can't talk now. Marcus is playing." And he meant Marcus Washington, who had gone to our high school. So, then I turned it on, the whole Al McGuire awareness. I contacted Marquette, about its journalism program. They sent a catalog. And next thing you know, I had to convince my dad, Marquette's a little pricier than Northern Illinois University, but I'd really prefer to go there. And we made it work. So, it was all sort of, in my little life and part of the world, it was all sort of preordained, I think, in a certain way.
Mm-hmm. You graduated from Lyons Township High School, where you were, as you indicated, Marcus Washington graduated. I think Bo Ellis said that Marcus Washington was the best defensive player he has ever seen at Marquette. What was Marcus Washington's kind of reputation back down there in high school, where you probably saw him when you were in grade school and maybe you were a freshman when he was possibly a senior?
Yeah, Lyons Township, the year before I got there, when I was in 8th grade, they won the Illinois State Championship. Marcus Washington was on a team with a fellow you might not remember, but he played at Maryland, Owen Brown. And they were pretty dynamic, Mr. Inside, Mr. Outside. Washington, very slight, super quick. I don't know if he was as quick as Dean Meminger in that 1215 Resort Mass that Al used to talk about. But he was pretty tenacious. He learned under the coach at Lyons Township, a guy named Ron Nikovich, who had a great reputation among high school coaches, certainly in the Chicago area and Illinois. And when Washington went to Marquette, that was just a little bump in the awareness for Marquette among our students. It was the biggest high school at the time in Illinois, Lyons Township. And I'm actually surprised that they haven't had more successful alumni in terms of basketball. Probably the most famous alumnus from that school, basketball-wise, is Jeff Hornacek.
Oh, sure. So when you arrived at Marquette then, that was just after the fall of 74, that was just after Marcus Washington had graduated. Was a senior on the team that lost in the Final Four, lost in the final championship game in '74 to David Thompson and North Carolina State Wolfpack. And so there was the mini rebuild. There was a mini rebuild after Lucas went pro early, but Marquette was, I think, 23-4 that first year, and they were probably 24-5 or something the next year. But you started covering them, arguably the top two teams of all time, back to back. The first season then was the 1976-77 team, 1975-76 team. Some people say that was Al's best team. That's what guards of Lloyd Walton and Butch Lee, forwards of Bo Ellis and Earl Tatum, and the center was Jerome Whitehead.
Man.
So that was, they went 27-2 that year. Take us back when you first started covering them. What was your take? What was the vibe on campus?
Well, I remember, now Mary Schmidt Boyer, with whom I worked in Milwaukee and who covered the NBA for a long, long time in Cleveland, she, also in Minnesota, she was a sports editor of the campus paper. And if you were the Tribune sports editor, your beat was the Warriors season. I was writing for the campus paper then. I didn't cover any of the games then, but I obviously paid attention. They were such a high profile team. I mean, that was the first year of the tails out jerseys, right? That Bo Ellis was known to have allegedly took a hand in designing. And yeah, you're right. I mean, when you send, the core of that team then fed into the championship team a year later, but the two guys primarily missing were both in the NBA during the championship season, Lloyd Walton and Earl Tatum. So you take two NBA prospects off a team. I mean, that team was pretty darn good. And I think the feeling with that 75-76 team was that they could win the title. They just happened to have to face Indiana, which was in the midst of a perfect season. If I recall correctly, was it Butch who was injured by the time of their game down in Baton Rouge? And he was not 100%. He and Lloyd, in particular, the backcourt had a tough game against the Hoosiers. But as far as dominance, much better regular season than the title team.
Yeah, that team lost at Minnesota in overtime in December and won the rest of their games. And that overtime loss, Earl Tatum had 35 points. And then they won the rest of their games, so they were 26-1, ranked second in the country behind Indiana that year. And they played Western Michigan and beat them by about 5. And then they played Indiana. And I think when number 1 played number 2, Marquette and Indiana played in the Mideast Regional. That was the game where the NCAA started thinking, wait a second, we have to start seeding these brackets. This was a good Final Four game. This wasn't a good regional game. So I think that game really had a lot of impact in the NCAA tournament going forward.
No, it's a great point. I mean, I look here real quick, and Lloyd Walton was 1 for 9. Butch was 4 for 18 in that game against Indiana in Baton Rouge. So it really was the backcourt struggle against pretty dynamic Indiana backcourt with Quinn Buckner and Bobby Wilkerson.
Steve, you were around Al McGuire, of course. Everybody has an impression. Talk about Al, the coach, and Al, the leader and person you came to know.
Yeah, I when I tell people about the Al McGuire that I knew, from getting to meet and know him, covering that team, on through my years working in Milwaukee, when he had gone on to television work, I play off the old commercial. I call him the most interesting man I ever met. His outlook on life, the things he did, the comments he came up with, he was like no one else that I've ever covered, and frankly, have ever known. Um, the you know the I guess the story about him sort of being a game coach and not much of a practice coach, and letting Hank Raymonds and Rick Vageris do the heavy lifting in between the games at the alumni gym. I mean, I saw that, but I also saw Al on practice days where he would jump in, he'd make his points. He delegated a lot to those guys, which is important if you're going to be a leader. But there was no doubt, whose team that was. He couldn't have done it without those lieutenants, but he definitely did the work. And just I just feel like I got so much experience. I told Al one time in the '90s, I said, I blame you for this career I've had, this misspent life as a sports writer, because I thought it was always going to be so much fun as it had been covering the Warriors with him as head coach. I mean, it was a circus. It was always interesting. There was always something coming up. Some not so good things. I mean, there were brush fires that had to be dealt with about players and their free time and things like that. But it was just fascinating. I mean, it was sort of a pro environment, maybe even more than what a pro environment is now, because of how young the NBA is. But it was colorful. The players had strong personalities, and the coach sort of let them be that way. I mean, we all know about the sniping on the sideline and during games. Coaches, Al yelling at a player like Lloyd Walton yelling back at him. I mean, that just wasn't tolerated. With a guy like the General Bobby Knight and so many of the Martinet college coaches. But Al thrived in that environment, and his teams ultimately did as well.
The great Steve Ashburner is with us, of course, covering Marquette basketball, a fantastic career, and still active and going strong, NBA.com today. Steve, is there a story about the team and Al or what have you that most stands out in your mind? And I know there's a litany, but is there one that comes to your mind right away when you think of that group back in the early to mid 70s?
Well, it's hard to get past the announcement of Al's retirement that he dropped on everybody. It had come, I think it was like on a Friday in December, and I had already headed home to the Chicago suburbs, having wrapped up my last final of that semester. And it turns out I was going to visit my high school journalism teacher that evening. And when I rang his doorbell and he opened his door and he said, "Wow, that's some big news about your coach." And I, like a good reporter, I said, "What are you talking about?" And then he dropped it on me that, Al had announced his retirement. I hadn't been around the TV or anything, and I was in Chicago, so it might not have gotten the same play, but he had heard about it. And I recall hightailing it up to Marquette the next day on Saturday. I believe they played Louisville. And, the atmosphere was weird that night at the arena. And I can only imagine what it was like in the pregame locker room for the players. I mean, they just learned that their coach was leaving at the end of the year. And, what did that say about this season, that they were still, involved in competing? And they lost that game, if I recall correctly, in overtime. Butch Lee had a chance, I think, to ice it and missed a free throw. And they lost again to Minnesota right after that, during that Christmas break, I think in the Milwaukee Classic. So that to me was the pivot point. No one knew what that was going to lead to. It looked like that was just going to be a downward spiral from that point. They ended up losing 7 games during the regular season. No NCAA champ had ever had 7 losses in their season, and somehow they were flatlined and got resuscitated and that propelled them the rest of the way. But I think that Minnesota game, it came up with me multiple times because when I worked in the Twin Cities and covered the Timberwolves, Flip Saunders, their late coach, he was a guard on that Minnesota Gophers team, and he used to tell me about, we beat Marquette that year and they won the championship. We just weren't eligible for the tournament because of NCAA infractions. And I use that old Woody Allen line. Well, 80% of life is showing up. You weren't in the tournament. You can't claim that you were a better team than Marquette. Certainly not that at that time of the season for the Warriors. So that's probably my biggest memory. Otherwise, there's a lot of shared billing. A lot of ties for second place to the shocker of Al's retirement announcement.
Mm-hmm. There's so much about relationships, isn't it, in this business? I know that's part of your passion. You have a tremendous gift. I've always felt what a marvelous writer Steve is. But the people say in my retirement years, what do you want to go out there and, get behind the microphone? This is wonderful here. John Dodd's making it possible, our producer, Jason Ruck. But to me, it's always the people and the relationships. How important is that in your hierarchy, Steve?
It's huge. It's huge. And it's one of the things, and not just for me, but it's the kind of thing where you think, well, is this as much fun? Do you feel like you're doing the job you set out to do? Because professional sports leagues in general, and I include the NBA, they have tightened the access and made it more difficult to talk to players, to get to know coaches. You're not around them as much. They limit the availability, and it puts a wall. When I cover professional athletes, it's their salaries, but it's also the distance from media and fans. It's like they live in gated communities, literally and figuratively, where you don't have the same feel when. I started out when if you traveled with a sports team, they flew on your flights because you all flew commercial. And nowadays with pro teams particularly, it's charter flights. You don't see each other at the airport. You usually don't stay in the same hotel because of budgets, and there's a distance. And what happens, I even attribute the growth and fascination with analytics to this, is you have to fill the void somehow. So if you don't know as much about these players as people and their backgrounds and their ambitions and their dreams and whatever, you fill it up. And so you get a lot of writing that is stats based, and that can be good. It opens up a certain area that maybe didn't have as much development before, but it also reduces people to numbers and digits on a screen in a way that I don't think is truly grasping what this is about. It doesn't speak to the passion I think a lot of fans have for the sports they cover, to know that, well, I'm covering somebody who, holds the opponent 12 points below his usual average accuracy in the pick and roll. And it's like, okay, that's good, but not everybody watches their sports to be an assistant coach. And I think it has materially changed what I do.
And it always impressed me the way you did these people stories with players and coaches. And so, to a degree, as you say, in this day and age, it's been taken away. You've had to reinvent yourself to stay at the top of your game, haven't you?
Well, yeah, you always have to please your boss, whoever your boss happens to be at any given point in time. When you talk about the people stories, I got to admit that, the thing that stands out for me post Marquette days for me was working at the Milwaukee Journal during a season in which Rick Majerus was having some turmoil with the team there. There were some unhappy players. The wins and losses were out of whack from what fans there had grown accustomed to. And in general, it appeared to a lot of us that Rick felt a lot of pressure to uphold the traditions and even reinvent himself as another Al McGuire. And so I did a long story for the Milwaukee Journal one weekend that got a lot of attention. It was about how Majerus was struggling. in that role. And I remember when there was a Channel 12 reporter, Kathy Michaelby, who called me and asked if she could come interview me for the Saturday evening news. I think our early edition carried that Majerus story. And I said, well, okay. I was living in an apartment in Wauwatosa. I said, if you come to me, I'm not going to come downtown. And they came out to the lawn of the Six Flat in which I lived, did a stand-up interview out there. And when it ran in the story that night, the little identifier under my name was Majerus's harshest critic.
Ooh.
And so it's like, well, I guess that's one claim to fame I can take with me, to my grave. I just thought I was reporting, but I'm proud the story was tough. But yeah, I have friends who still tease me in Milwaukee as Majerus's harshest critic. I don't know that I'm seen as anybody harshest critic other than that.
That's not who you are, that's for sure. And I'm sure Rick Majerus knew that, the late great one.
Yeah.
Well, I got along okay with him after that. But I think there was a little wariness,
Sure.
we both sort of knew. I knew he might not like of how I had written about him, and he knew how I had written about him in that instance. And I think it was a grudging respect from both sides.
Mm-hmm.
Rick Majerus not making it at Marquette, I'll go to my grave with that's one of the biggest questions, because I remember when I was 17, Rick Majerus was my hero. Rick Majerus was different. He would drive that Pacer. He'd have 30 basketballs in the back of the Pacer. He would show up in a three-piece suit world. He would show up in a sweatsuit for recruiting. He became Uncle Rick when he was recruiting became a member of the family. And I thought, this guy is going to be perfect, but it just didn't work out. He lost the North Carolina game by a bucket after having about an 9-point lead with about 2 minutes to go.
Remember that one.
That's the one that I think would have put him over the top at Marquette. But I asked Al McGuire, I interviewed Al McGuire one time, and I said, Al, why didn't Rick Majerus make it at Marquette? Because you could see then how good he was at Ball State, Utah, St. Louis. And he said he had to get away. He just had to. He said he went away to Ball State after 3 years. He said Don Nelson hired him for the Bucks to kind of,
That's right.
He parachuted out of Marquette for that year. And he said he went to Ball State. By the time those 2 years at Ball State, he said he was a different coach. He really grew up. That's what he needed to do, get away. And then what you saw when he took Utah to the Final Four, that was the real Rick Majerus.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I always heard that too, and I never really heard anyone pin down how did he change as a coach. Did his expectations change? Did he shift from defense to offense as an orientation? Anything like that? It seemed more like just a personal get out of that glare, create his own footsteps rather than following in Al's.
You mentioned when Al retired before the Louisville game. I attended that Louisville game, and you're right. There was a feeling at the Mecca that night that something was wrong. It was just the team wasn't sharp. And at the end of the game, it was tie score, and Butch Lee went in for a bucket, power move, and he got fouled just as the buzzer went off. And the referees talked about it, and they sent Butch to the line with nobody around him. So it was like he was shooting a technical free throw. And he went up there and he missed. It was 2 shots, and he missed both of them. And Butch Lee was about an 87% free throw shooter. So the whole thing was wrong. Then they lost in overtime. I want to say Ricky Gallen was with Louisville. Louisville was top 20 rated, really good team. But then they lost to Minnesota. But you could just tell that there was something off the team. Then they went on a 10-game winning streak. They lost to Pat Cummings at Cincinnati, and they lost by 1 point to Cincinnati. And some of the players were a little irate about Pat Cummings kind of rubbing it in and being a little mouthy during the game. And that came back to haunt Pat Cummings, which I'll get into in a second here. But then a crazy thing happened. Marquette lost their last 3 home games, and they fell down to record was 16-6, and they lost to Detroit, DePaul, and Wichita State.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's ever a time when you look at Dick Vitale on ESPN and Marquette is mentioned, either the game, the broadcaster will turn to him and say, "Now, Dick, you beat Al McGuire that year. They won the championship, didn't you?" He has milked that win for more verbiage on his shows, on his broadcast, than any time ever. So he beat him on a last-second shot. It was either John Long or Terry Durod or whatever. But I want to get to you. What did you think when they lost their last 3 their home games?
Yeah, I mean that seemed to be curtains for the championship ambitions at that point, and the losses to DePaul and to Detroit. I mean, those were bad enough. But then when they lost the Al's final home game in Milwaukee to Wichita State, the mood in the building that night turned ugly. I mean, there was booing. I know from a fact from my roommates that that when they were walking back to campus after that game, people were tearing down street signs, turning over garbage cans. I mean, there was a general rowdiness and crankiness. Really unhappy at what they had just witnessed. Everybody was there. That halftime ceremony where Al and Pat, his wife, were out there, and Al had on they had the boutonnieres, and Al had the houndstooth jacket, and it was supposed to be this, all right, career sort of acknowledgement, and a very good team. Obviously, Wichita State was good, but Marquette was expected to win that game, and when that didn't happen, you had Cheese Johnson, I recall that guy for his nickname, and Bob Elmore. They were the 2 big studs for Wichita State.
Wow, was that fun. Steve Ashburner, brought to you by Moonlight Graham Modern Dental Benefits. Moonlight Graham, a proud sponsor of the MarquetteHoops.com basketball show, and our new sponsor, Sartori Cheese. You know of them, and Jim Sartori. We appreciate having them aboard. John, you've got a great website as we wrap up to chat about.
Sure, MarquetteHoops.com. It's part of the 24/7 CBS Digital Network, and we'll archive all of our previous shows and this show at the site. And if you'd like to be on our list for our free newsletter, please drop your email address in our widget. It's right on the front page. And please, if you could send out notices to all Marquette fans to tell them about our show.
Outstanding. Well, that's another edition of the MarquetteHoops.com basketball show. We hope you enjoy it, and we'll have many more. For John Dodds, our producer, Jason Ruck, I'm Tom Pippins. Thanks, everybody, and God bless you. We'll see you next time, and go Marquette.